explains, in addition to using sewage surveillance to combat other public health issues, more than 50 nations are now monitoring the spread of COVID in sewage to help scientists track cases, predict surges, and identify where to target medical resources like testing. As an early warning system, people who are infected shed virus fragments days before they show symptoms. At college campuses, scientists test wastewater for infection. When a sample comes back positive, the university sends targeted messages to encourage students housed in affected buildings to get tested and isolate. Wastewater tracking provides a cheap and effective alternative, catching up to 85% of cases on campus. The Netherlands also used these estimates to make decisions about lockdowns. It is more accurate than diagnostic testing because it includes the asymptomatic and isn't dependent on willingness to get tested. The Hans India News furthers just last month that wastewater testing serves as a cost-effective early warning system in India. Early identification of clusters help guide the COVID-19 response and give Indian policymakers the information they need to better allocate limited pandemic resources. Because the community possesses a right to public health, government protection of that right is the only way to ensure it, and because unique government tools that violate civil liberties are essential elements of emergency response, I affirm. And I'm open for cross.
Okay, is everybody ready? Sounds good. Let's start on preserving community, your criterion. Is anything justified in the name of preserving community?
I would say that different public health scenarios or different scenarios in general that threaten communities merit different levels of response. For instance, we have a car accident problem, but the solution to that is to mess with the speed limit laws or make people wear seatbelts, not to restrict freedom of voting, right?
Okay, so like you would defend reasonable limitations of civil liberties that are like tied to public health emergencies.
Yeah. And I think and I'm not defending everyone in every scenario. I think each one has a time and place, and that's why I'm defending the violation of civil liberties just as a tool in the toolbox of responding to public health emergencies.
Okay, why does the affirmative get to defend an idealistic version of implementation?
It's not idealistic, right? It's just not dystopian. I think if we looked at the round the way the negative probably wanted to look at it, it would force me into this really dystopian, very specific and extreme view that authoritarian countries usually tend to abuse certain tools. But all I'm advocating for is that there's nothing intrinsically problematic about violating civil liberties in public health emergencies.
Okay, why doesn't the affirmative have to defend effectiveness?
Because the resolution isn't a question of effectiveness. The resolution is quite clearly a question of, on principle, is there a problem with violating civil liberties in a public?
Why are principles valuable to justify in the first place?
I think that principles are a question of like what is intrinsically just, right? What the goal of that action is. Like,
okay, so if the goal of that action is to be like guide some sort of effective consequence, why don't you have to defend the effectiveness of implementation?
Okay, so let's take an example. During wartime, countries oftentimes use the justification of self-defense to justify invading other countries, which is terrible. But it doesn't mean that the principle of self-defense is no longer a justification for taking action. It's the same thing here. Just because it might go wrong sometimes in implementation, that doesn't mean that the fundamental justification of the tool of violating civil liberties is intrinsically wrong and unjustified.
Okay, let's talk about that self-defense example. What gives us justification for self-defense?
Saving lives.
Okay, so, okay.
And like protecting ourselves.
Okay, let's go to contention 2 about vaccine mandates. In the countries like the United States or Mongolia, who are like wildly ahead on vaccine and their vaccinations in their population right now, why don't like vaccine mandates in other countries? Why haven't they reached the same levels of vaccination?
Well, I think you just cherry picked a couple examples. I read counterexamples in my case from Italy, Australia, and France in a meta-study that showed that immunization actually increases vaccination rates. But even then, if you don't want to take the action of mandated vaccines, you can just mandate things like quarantine, which also stop the spread of diseases and have been empirically proven to work.
Okay, I'll take PrEP. I'll stop prep with 2:20 remaining. Is everybody ready? Okay. In El Salvador, a police officer detained, beat, and shot a man on his way to buy food and fuel because he was violating quarantine. In Venezuela, government officials called Colombian refugees biological weapons sent to infect their citizens. It is because I oppose these actions that I negate the resolution resolved. A public health emergency justifies limiting civil liberties. Observation. Principles are only valuable because they guide action. Thus, the debate must surround how governments actually implement and enforce civil liberties limitations during public health emergencies, not how they potentially or ideally could. I also value justice, and I'll define it the same way. My criterion is minimizing oppression. First, the oppressed lack justice most, so prioritizing them is key to achieving the value. But second, those who are oppressed are treated as non-human, so they are morally excluded from other frameworks. Thus, oppression should be the first priority of any system of ethics. Contention 1 is government overstep. Woodley in 2020 explains that public health emergencies are often easily spread but less deadly, like the swine flu, or more deadly but less easily spread, like MERS. Thus, civil liberty violations are generally unnecessary. When governments do impose restrictions, they often overstep their bounds. Rothstein in 2015 explains that during the SARS epidemic, Taiwan quarantined over 130,000 people despite only having 2 confirmed cases. These restrictions cause disproportionate public panic and limited travel, which can hurt low-income and migrant workers. In these cases, the trade-off isn't justified. In the remaining cases, governments should prioritize using positive, non-intrusive measures to encourage voluntary distancing. Hogg et al. In 2020 explains that 5 out of 10 of the most effective government interventions in COVID didn't involve civil liberties violations. The study examined over 42,000 interventions from 226 countries. This includes measures like increasing the availability of personal protective equipment or providing assistance to vulnerable populations. Contention 2 is over-policing. The only way to limit a civil liberty is to threaten punishment behind it. Amnesty International in 2020 tells us that in all regions, authorities have used COVID restrictions to amplify policing. There are a few ways this happens. Subpoint A is detention and violence for violating lockdown. In El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, and the Philippines, police detained over 200,000 people for lockdown violations. In Belgium, France, Greece, Italy, and Romania, among others, police used force to impose lockdown measures on people who didn't pose a serious threat. In Kenya, 7 people were killed and 16 hospitalized due to police within the first 5 days of a curfew. Subpoint B is suppressing dissent. In Turkey, Venezuela, Morocco, Egypt, Poland, and China, among others, journalists, bloggers, and even health workers have been arrested for expressing their views on COVID measures. Police have also arrested those protesting COVID responses, like lack of resources for health workers. Subpoint C is targeting marginalized populations. Inviting policing exacerbates racial bias. Additionally, in Trinidad and Tobago, Qatar, and Libya, thousands of refugees and migrant workers have been expelled under the guise of COVID concerns. In some European countries, authorities have targeted refugee and migrant camps with mandatory quarantines without evidence that they posed a serious threat. In France, Spain, and the United Kingdom, among others, homeless people have been fined for not being able to comply with movement restrictions. LGBT shelters in Uganda, Kenya, and Sri Lanka have been targeted under the pretext that they're more likely to spread disease. Limitations on civil liberties only enable excessive police control and violence. Now let's go to the affirmative. On the criterion, I have 3 responses. First is that this is bad because it's vague. What preserves the community best? Communities have different standards of what is good, and even if they didn't, different goods come into conflict. Only the negative criterion specifies the demographic that we're focusing on, which is the only way to weigh in the round. But second, justice isn't what's generally best for everyone. We both defined it as giving each their due. Fairness primarily concerns those who are lacking what they're due, which is why we should focus on most marginalized populations first. But third, look to the second justification I give you under my criterion, saying that when you oppress people, you dehumanize them as part of that oppression, which means they're morally excluded from the communities that you want to preserve in the first place. Now go to the observation. They say that excuses don't negate the resolution, but I have 2 responses here. First is that you should prefer a general interpretation of the resolution. It's literally on the ballot that you're going to write. Otherwise, the act can bring up infinite hypothetical scenarios where limitations might be good. If I prove to you that in most instances limitations are bad, you should vote for the negative. But secondly, don't buy the analogy that they're going to bring up about self-defense. It's different because self-defense is on an individual level is probably okay, but claiming self-defense on a government level isn't. The resolution is concerning government action, which means that generally it's still bad. Now into contention 1 about a right to public health. I have 3 answers. First is that just because we have a right to public health doesn't mean that that always justifies limitations. In the majority of instances, emergencies are not widespread. And when they are, encouraging voluntary cooperation where it's sufficient to curtail them. We should strike a balance between public health and autonomy, which is what the negative is trying to do. But second is that I agree that we should care about the safety of others. That's why you should vote for the negative. Insofar as voluntary measures are sufficient, and when you implement limitations that necessarily invites policing, that's probably bad. Third, you have to make the affirmative defend effectiveness. The only reason why principles are valued in the first place is because they guide action. On to contention 2. They cite 2 things here, which is quarantines and vaccine mandates. I'm going to go down both of them. Let's start on quarantines. First, look to my contention 1 evidence. It's pretty good at telling you that 5 out of 10 of the most effective measures during COVID were not limitations on civil liberties. Insofar as they're similarly as effective, even if they're not 100% as effective, they can make up a majority of what the app wants to solve in the first place. And any deficit is definitely outweighed by the brutality of policing, which leads to the second argument. Contention 2 tells you that every single limitation requires some sort of enforcement. Quarantine measures are used as pretext for governments to do things like expel refugees or target marginalized populations, which only furthers oppression. Now into the idea of vaccines. I have 2 answers here. First is that the US is wildly ahead of other countries on vaccinations right now, as is like Mongolia. Neither of these countries mandate vaccines. Want to know what they did? They prioritized positive, non-intrusive measures to encourage and distribute vaccinations across the country. There's no reason why mandates are necessary. But second, if anything, coercive methods for vaccine mandates can spawn backlash and decrease trust, which jeopardizes future responses to public health emergencies and future cooperation. And third is that even then, if you don't buy any of those arguments on quarantine or vaccination, winning non-intervention is sometimes bad doesn't mean intervention is just. The affirmative still has a positive obligation to tell you why inviting things like over-policing is ever okay. Now into the third point about surveillance. I'm going to cross-apply or look to the evidence I cite to you in my contention 1. Tracing and tracking and surveillance were both included in these studies. These interventions were ranked 28th and 40th respectively. In encouraging voluntary measures are ranked higher than these, which means that there are instances in which voluntary measures can do what the affirmative wants, and we can avoid over-policing, which is probably the best scenario. No negative. Open for cross-check.
Okay, is everyone else ready? Great. Then let's begin. Okay, so let's talk about your framework of justice and minimizing structural oppression. Under this framework, is it ever okay to violate civil liberties?
Yeah.
Okay, when?
In the scenario of the resolution. So wait. Is it okay to violate civil liberties? Oh, no, not in this specific scenario. It would
I'm just
be okay.
asking, okay, sorry. Continue.
It would be okay if like the consequences of violating those civil liberties preserved more like bodily autonomy for the marginalized.
Gotcha. Okay, so let me give you an example. Can I drive on the left side of the road to protest the government?
No, but there are other means of protesting the government, which would probably be more reasonable.
Okay, gotcha. So sometimes the government should be able to tell the people the ways in which their protests are acceptable.
Yeah, I don't think your hypothetical scenario, though, is applicable to the resolution.
I'm just asking purely as a matter of principle. It's okay under your framework for the government to sometimes limit the ways in which we protest it, for example.
Sure.
Okay, gotcha. Let's talk about government overstep and actually over policing as well. So I just want to be clear. Some of the countries you mentioned like are the US and France and stuff like that. But other countries you mentioned are places like the Philippines and places that already violate civil liberties, right? Like
yeah, but the problem is that implementing limitations gives police way more jurisdiction to brutalize their citizens because now they can arrest people for just like moving around.
In order to affirm, do I have to defend that the Philippines is going to correctly violate rights?
You don't have to defend every single instance, but I cited to you like dozens of countries where over-policing has occurred, including in traditionally democratic nations. You have to
let's talk about over-policing. Is there anything intrinsic to the affirmative that means we can't just mail someone a fine if they don't quarantine or something?
What happens when they don't pay that fine? Like police are going to be involved at some point in order to enforce these measures.
Okay, is the stance of the neg that police are always bad?
The negative is saying that policing in cases of civil liberties violations, especially during the pandemic, has been like on balance pretty bad.
I'm just asking what the stance of the neg is on police.
Police might be okay in some scenarios.
Gotcha. Okay, in what scenarios?
I don't know, like protecting security.
Gotcha. Okay, let's talk about the fact that 5 out of 10 voluntary measures. In 5 out of 10 countries, like, or something, voluntary measures were 5 out of the 10 most successful, right?
Mhm.
What about the other 5?
Okay, so the other 5 are involuntary measures, but this isn't saying that just using voluntary measures will have half of the effect. It's saying that 5 out of 10 of the top measures are voluntary, which means they're similarly as effective.
Gotcha. When we negate, why will countries do these good voluntary measures?
Because they're doing them right now. It was analyzing interventions that are already in place.
Gotcha. I am going to take prep time. Starting now. Okay, I'll stop prep there, and I think I have about 1:05 left. Okay, wonderful. The order is going to be going on the paradox of public health and the inequities argument on my case, jumping over to the NC, and then back over to the AC. I'll let you know where I am throughout the speech. Okay. Is everyone ready? You can start on the paradox of public health argument because this proves that only mandatory measures can be effective. My opponent reads evidence that 5 out of the 10 most effective measures are voluntary, which doesn't really account for the fact that they still require mandatory measures alongside them. Dezikes in 2020 of MIT explains that it was only once mandatory lockdown measures happened that half of the people who were going to travel stopped traveling, which is why quantifiably Flaxman 20 of the Imperial College of London found that 3.1 million deaths have been averted due to mandatory quarantine in specific. That's because Dr. Lowenstein explains that decision-making biases means that humans are rooted in the present and don't consider the future benefits of their current actions. My opponent also says that this harms the marginalized, but that doesn't account for my second warrant about inequities, which means that they are the most effective because the people who are the most marginalized are following them. We require mandatory measures so that people who aren't marginalized, namely wealthy folk, will actually abide by these measures. Baller in 2019 explains that wealthy people will simply sidestep voluntary measures because they simply have the time and the resources to do so, which is why Drew in 2019 explains that according to in Italy, Australia, and France, it took mandatory measures to make sure that wealthy people were actually complying with measures that helps the most marginalized people. My opponent just gives the examples of the US and Mongolia, but I have counterexamples and counter warrants to this. My opponent also says that trust reduces, yet never provides any evidence for why we care about this or why this matters. I would argue we still see empirical benefits, even if trust does reduce. But then my opponent says that this doesn't mean intervention is just. It's just under my opponent's own framework because it minimizes structural oppression against the most marginalized by public health emergencies. But let's jump over to my opponent's case on their value of justice and value criterion of reducing oppression. We agree on the value, but a few responses to the value criterion. First of all, I would argue that community is uniquely key to reducing oppression. Think about this even historically. We can look to the Black Lives Matter movement and the Civil Rights Movement, which were both communities that we empowered so that they could fight things like structural oppression. But second of all, we limit your rights and we limit your freedoms once you infringe on your community. That's why you can't drive on the left side of the road, which means these rights-based conceptions are limited directly by your harms to others. But let's go to the contention one about government overstep. My opponent basically says civil liberties violations are unnecessary and that voluntary measures work, but there's a few responses. First of all, Phil Ho of King's College in 2020 explains that underreach now will lead to overreach down the road. That's the phenomenon we saw in Brazil when Bolsonaro didn't do anything at the beginning of the pandemic. It got out of control, and then he went to his people and said, oh, look how bad this is. Now I need to violate your liberties 10 times more harshly. But then let's go on to my opponent's, I've already responded to my opponent's argument about voluntariness, but let's go to my opponent's contention too about over-policing. Group their subpoint A and subpoint B together, they all rely on the same premises. There's a few problems here. First of all, the vast majority of my opponent's arguments rely on the fact that they're cherry-picking authoritarian countries or hybrid regimes. I don't have to defend that the Philippines is going to correctly implement the AF, but second of all, there's nothing inherent to the AF that means we can't simply mail someone a fine or do something less malicious that involves law enforcement less. My opponent can't force me into defending these methods. But on to the subpoint C about targeting the most marginalized. First of all, cross-apply what I've already said about the wealthy people not complying until there are mandates. The people who are complying in the voluntary world are the people who are the most marginalized. But second of all, Kishi in 2020 turns this against my opponent because in the absence of government action, vigilante groups take enforcement into their own hands and target minorities. That's what we saw in places like Costa Rica and Panama before there was government action. Back to my case. Let's begin on my value criterion of preserving community. My opponent makes a few arguments, none of which respond to the idea that we care about marginalized communities, but most importantly, we care about the survival of communities before we can even consider their values. Before communities can form value sets like caring about reducing structural oppression, they have to first and foremost be surviving. But you can extend my warrant that the only reason we care about things like freedom of speech and association are because there are people listening to us. That's already a unique reason to prefer my framework and prefer the idea of community. But let's go to the contention one about the community's right to public health. My opponent cross-applies the voluntary arguments, but doesn't respond to the premise that my freedom is limited when I'm uniquely affecting your ability to take actions.
I'll take the rest of that. Okay, is everybody ready? It'll be, I'll talk about framework first, then neg, and then aff. Okay. Let's start on the observation they conceded that principles are only valuable because they guide action, which means you have to look at how governments actually implement and enforce these measures, not how they ideally could. They say that I'm cherry picking examples. I'll tell you why that's not true later. Now onto the criterion debate. I'm going to point out 3 arguments here. 2 of them that they conceded. First is that preserving community is super vague because communities have different ideals of what's good. And even when they don't have different ideas of what's good, those different goods come into conflict. We should prioritize oppression because it gives you a pretty specific demographic to focus on. They say that community is key to minimizing oppression. Sure, that doesn't negate that my criterion is still fine. We should focus on minimizing oppression because those are the ones who lack justice most. Now onto contention 1 about overstep. They say that underreach leads to overreach, but this is outside of the scope of what the negative is defending. I'm defending that on principle, like in a public health emergency, civil liberties violations are not okay. That means that if civil liberties violations happen later during a public health emergency, the negative would also defend that those are unjust. I'm going to point out a lot of the arguments I made here. The first being that in a majority of public health emergencies, civil liberties violations are unnecessary because they're easily spread and not deadly at all, or they're more deadly but less easily spread. And I'm going to talk about the Hog et al. Evidence that tells you that voluntary measures or encouraging voluntary measures works. This is going to be pretty important. It's an analysis of over 42,000 interventions from 226 countries. Don't let them say I'm cherry picking examples when this is a pretty holistic study telling you that 5 out of the top 10 government interventions during COVID were positive and non-intrusive. I'm not talking about people just voluntarily quarantining themselves on their own. I'm talking about governments actively and educating their public, actively getting personal protective equipment out there. Positive and non-intrusive measures that are forms of government intervention but aren't limitations on civil liberties are effective or similarly as effective as intrusive measures. Now go to contention 2 about over-policing. First, they say I'm cherry picking examples. No, I'm definitely not. I've name dropped dozens of countries for you that have all increased policing. I'm not just talking about authoritarian regimes. I'm talking about traditionally democratic countries as well, like France, Spain, Italy, the United States, the United Kingdom, that are using limitations as justifications for police to marginalize refugees and migrants, for example, to detain and injure and kill hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians because they're violating lockdown, which is probably an unjust response. The second response is that we can just fine people, but 2 things here. First, I answered this in Crossexamination. If you don't pay a fine, there has to be some sort of threat of government force behind it. But second, this doesn't make sense in the context of the negative. How do you fine someone for breaking movement restrictions? This requires some sort of direct contact with the police. Then they talk about these examples of like Costa Rica and Panama. But earlier they said we shouldn't cherry pick countries. I've given you examples of every region in the world where imposing limitations has only increased policing, which is definitely unjust. Now go to the affirmative. Remember on the observation that we should prefer a general interpretation of the resolution. I'm not asking the affirmative to defend that in every single country that limitations are always okay. I'm asking you to defend why it's ever okay for literally all countries, or not all countries, but all regions of the world to have countries that are using limitations to justify over-policing, including democratic countries. Now go to contention 2 about the impact. Let's talk about quarantines and vaccine mandates. Quarantines, you're going to prefer the voluntary evidence. They say that their evidence says that it requires mandatory interventions alongside voluntary measures, but my study isn't talking about people just voluntarily cooperating on their own. It's talking about positive government intervention. Plus, my study isolates the differences between these 2. If 5 out of 10 of the top 10 interventions are sufficient or similarly as effective as intrusive measures, then you vote for the negative. Even if there's some deficit, the fact that over-policing brutalizes so many citizens and marginalizes people is probably sufficient to vote negative because it implies that public health emergencies can end with voluntary measures, whereas policing is a guaranteed response to imposing any sort of limitation. Now go to the vaccine mandates. They say that their evidence is better than my examples of the US and Mongolia right now, but don't really explain why. But I'm also going to point out the backlash argument here. They say I don't tell you why this matters, but I'm saying that specifically the same wealthy people you're talking about right now who don't want to comply with vaccines right now will not want to comply in the future if they think the government is coercing them to take the actions that they want. On the point about surveillance, I'm going to talk about the argument again that my study accounts for things like surveillance. Neither of these measures, tracking and tracing or surveillance, rank even in the top 20 measures. Voluntary measures or positive non-intrusive government intervention is best. The 2 voters for today. First is going to be encouraging voluntary compliance. This resolves a majority of the affirmative. My study isolates the differences between non-intrusive and intrusive measures. Don't let them use their study as leverage against mine, because it's not talking about positive measures. It's talking about just how people voluntarily quarantine on their own. The fact that they're similarly as effective 5 out of 10 times, or can make up a majority of what the affirmative wants to solve in the first place, is sufficient to vote for the negative, because even if they aren't 100% as effective as intrusive measures, any of deficit is outweighed by the effective policing, which is the second voter for today. Policing. Police violence in the pandemic arbitrarily kills and incarcerates people for minor violations. This should come first in the round, because an action that invites, like actively invites policing, means that citizens lose bodily security and are oppressed by the state that was supposed to protect them in the first place. The affirmative ignores the lived realities of implementation. Don't let them do that, especially because they've conceded the observation. In France, Italy, Venezuela, Kenya, and dozens of other countries, hundreds of thousands of people have been detained, injured, or killed for violating curfews, or for even protesting against their government's poor COVID responses. Refugees have been expelled under the guise of COVID concerns. The negative is winning on breadth here alone. Remember that you're preferring whoever generally proves their side true. Even if the affirmative can bring you hypothetical instances where, or like specific instances where liberties violations are okay, you should vote for the negative, because they haven't defended over policing sufficiently. Vote neg.
Okay. About 105, starting now. Okay, the order of the speech is going to be framework, just briefly on burdens, and then 2 key voting issues. Everyone ready? Okay. Let's begin on why you prefer my framework of preserving community over my opponent's framework of reducing oppression. My opponent misses the point of my main response against their framework, which is that historically, we require strong, functioning, and existent communities in order to combat oppression. Take the examples of the civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. Before you can begin addressing structural oppression that is rooted in society in the long term, you must bolster community. But let's get into the burdens really quickly. I just want to clarify, I'll defend a general principle that you should affirm. I'm not going to defend these outlandish examples of authoritarian regimes violating civil liberties in atrocious ways. They've already done that. I said that in my last speech. But let's get into the key voting issues. I'm going to show you how you vote for me on principle and practically. The first key voting issue is why I win this round on principle. The argument that goes conceded throughout the round is the idea that your freedoms are limited at the point when they infringe on mine. That's why you can't drive on the left side of the road. It's because it harms your community so fundamentally. It's the same thing coming out of my case with the right to public health. The reason why you have to wear a mask and get vaccinated is because if you decide not to do either of those things, that directly increases my chances of getting the disease, which means you are interlinked to me. And in order to preserve community on face, the government must reinforce this right. My opponent says that there's only a small deficit between voluntary and mandatory measures. If there is any deficit, that already proves you have to reaffirm the right to public health. It is literally that simple. But let's say you're looking for some practical places to affirm as well. The second key voting issue is why you're affirming practically. A point here is structural oppression. Let's talk about this argument that wealthy people are basically free riders. I make this argument coming out of case, and it basically never goes substantively responded to. Remember, Baller 19 explains that wealthy people opt out of immunizations because it's simply more convenient for them and because they have the resources to handle the illness if they actually get sick, which is why Drew 19 of Nature explains in a meta-analysis that in Italy, Australia, and France, it literally took mandatory immunization mission to make sure that people got immunized. That's what my opponent is missing, is that the voluntary measures uniquely work on marginalized communities. On wealthy communities, those communities do not follow the restrictions until you force them to, which is why they empirically work. In the most quantified evidence in the round, which is why you prefer it, Flaxman in 2020 explains that 3.1 million deaths have been averted owing to quarantine intervention loans. That can be accounted for by wealthy people not doing anything about the public health emergency until the government forces them to. But let's get into the second point why you're voting for me practically. This is going to be the argument about democracy. If I win this argument, if I win the underreach leads to overreach argument, I'm winning under my opponent's own framework, because the worst harms, the most structurally oppressive regimes are those that are not democratic. Look to Phil Ho in 2020 of King's College, who explains that underreach now leads to overreach later. If you don't violate civil liberties in a healthy way, in a good way, by voting affirmative now, the negative world fails so badly that leaders like Bolsonaro go to their people and say, oh, look how bad this is. I'm going to violate your liberties 20 times more. If my opponent wants to defend the practical implications, make them defend that practical implication of voting neg today. Great round, and thank you so much for judging.
Yeah, great round.
Excellent round, everyone. Judges, just remember, until the decision has been announced, we need you to stay on the Zoom. And then once the decision's been announced and we cut the live stream, then you can make comments to the debaters. Thank you.
So what do we do now? Go to tab room and fill out the ballot?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
But I think, like, when you say fill out the ballot, it's just submitting who won and then editing feedback later, correct?
That would be fine, yes.
Okay.
I'm showing we've all submitted.
I agree. Would you go ahead and announce the decision to the room?
The decision to the room is 2-1 for the neg. Catherine Liu.
Each judge, if you would just confirm how you voted, please.
I voted for the neg.
I voted for the neg.
I voted for the AF.
Okay. I will let them know they can cut the live stream. I'll let you know when you can make any comments to the debaters. Thank you.